Good afternoon, everyone. Hey, Erin, thank you for joining us. My name is Gavin Sunwall. I'm the Counselor for Public Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Canberra. I just want to thank our audience for joining us for today's discussion with Erin Watson-Lynn on Australia, the U.S., and the future of the Indo-Pacific. Erin, how are you today?
Hi, Gavin. Yeah, look, I'm really well. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on today. It's fantastic.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you. I'm always delighted to have an opportunity to speak with you, but especially on this topic. Just by way of introduction, this is part of our series that we're doing from the U.S. Embassy in Canberra that we call Diplomacy Delivered, for lack of a better catchy phrase. But honestly, it's our way during COVID-19 to maintain contact with you in Australia who are interested in similar issues to us. Erin is a scholar, an author, one of the smartest people I have met in Australia. If there's a problem, I'm confident that Erin can solve it. She is well known and has long been associated with both academics and with the think tank world in Australia. Specializing in not just questions of the U.S.-Australian alliance in the Indo-Pacific, but also Australian and Latin American affairs, which we need to remember is part of the Pacific as well. Erin, it's a delight to have you this afternoon. Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend with us.
No, it's absolutely my pleasure, and I always find those introductions so awkward. But feel free to send me your problems, people. I do enjoy solving problems.
Absolutely. Every word I just said has the added benefit of being true. Also, one thing that we do like to highlight is when people have been on U.S.-sponsored programs. And Erin, I hope you don't mind if we start our conversation there. Erin was one of our participants on what we call our International Visitor Leadership Program, sponsored by the Department of State. For all of you viewing today, this program is meant to identify people, young up-and-coming people who are interested in things that we're also interested in. And it's a U.S. government facilitated program, really just to get you to the United States to talk to people who are looking at similar issues, similar challenges, to bring you together to make you better professionally and honestly make us smarter in the United States as well. So Erin, I hope you don't mind starting out today telling us a little bit about your experience on this program, what you liked, what surprised you maybe about we call it the IVLP, International Visitor Leadership Program.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. So I went on the IVLP back in, it was 2018 from memory, only a couple of years ago, and it was such an incredible experience. I hadn't been back to the US since I spent 4 months there when I was 20, and had, been very fortunate to spend a bit of time in the Midwest and the West Coast of the United States, but I hadn't been back. So when I was invited to come on this program, I was actually invited once and then I was unable to go. It was on a 3-week program, and fortunately you still let me back in the following year when I was able to travel. And we went on a really special program. It was a little bit different to many of the other IVLPs in that it was focused on the US and China relations, but for an Australian IVLP audience, if you will. So we were all Australians rather than having different countries. And there's pros and cons to doing it both ways. But and we had a slightly shorter program as well. But we packed a lot in. We went from Washington DC to San Francisco and then out to Hawaii. So no complaints there. We got to spend all of this time in Washington DC, but one of the coolest parts for me was I'd never been to New York City, and I arrived with a day to spare, and I thought, I can either sit in DC for a day or I can go and get on a train and I'm going to train all the way to New York City. And on the way, a friend messaged me on Instagram because I had, done a post on Instagram and
Mhm.
said, I'm in New York, I'll come and meet you. And she picked me up from the station and we walked around, I don't know, 20 kilometers around the city and I just saw everything. And then I got back up to DC. And yeah, I think it was just such a brilliant way to start the program. Um, and then we spent, the next 2 and a bit weeks traveling around and just every day, just back to back to back meetings. And, some of those, I was reflecting on some of those highlights today, walking past the vice president's office, walking past Nikki Haley's office when she was ambassador to the United Nations. And I just thought, oh, that's where she works. So you get that. We just got such great access to the corridors of power in DC, and such an extraordinary insight into what was going on at the time with that lens of US-China relations.
In terms of your thinking on US-China relations, or maybe even as an Australian, how US-China relations affect you or affect Australians in general, any surprises there? Did your thinking change at all during the course of the program?
Yeah, it really did, and I think that stems from the fact that in my career, I'd spent so much time in India, in particular, a little bit of time in Southeast Asia. I mean, I guess for the average person, like a lot of time, but career-wise, a couple of years working in Southeast Asia, um, and a few other sort of countries as well. I'd been to China, and but I hadn't really spent the time in DC. And so what I hadn't seen was that shift of thinking in the US around the relationship with China. And the thing that really struck me was not what was being said, and I think that's, we all know what various views are, but was that at every single layer of society, whether it was politicians, whether it was the bureaucracy or the administration, or whether it was um, chambers of commerce, everyone had the same view and had a shared and unified view on the US relationship with China, and there was this real sense of consensus around it. Whereas in Australia, we were still, in 2018, we were still very much divided, I think, between what the government was starting to say and how it was saying it, and also what the business community was saying. So the business community was still very much out there advocating quite loudly, I think, on the the Australia-China relationship for good reason. Like, we've benefited greatly from China and having a really strong trade relationship. But in the US, there was this real consensus between the two. And I think we've seen that increasingly in Australia since then. So it was sort of like the US was a little bit further ahead on that. So that was something that really sort of struck me when I went out there, and surprised me a little bit. I think the only, we went to a chamber of commerce in the Bay Area, and they were the only organization that weren't as deeply thinking that, but they were aware of the issues, but just weren't quite there yet. And maybe that had something to do with the proximity to the tech industry, or I don't know what that was, but otherwise there was consensus across the board.
It's interesting that you say that. One thing that we often note here, being representing the United States, is that we welcome more Australian leadership in this space. I think that honestly, China is will always be an important country for both of us. They're your largest trading partner. They're our largest trading partner. Even though, as we do like to note, you have a much larger economic relationship with us
Economically.
than you do with the People's Republic of China. Having said that, it's been interesting to me, having been here at the U.S. mission since about the time of your IVLP till now, seeing Australia really step up. In many ways, Australia was out in front of the United States for important decisions, such as the decision on 5G, And now definitely in calling for more transparency and investigating the origins of COVID-19 and other important leadership moments for Australia. And honestly, leading the world in dealing with China on important issues such as these. So I've kind of seen the evolution here and have been impressed as just as an American here in Australia as well. I don't want to go too far down that road. The team here reminds me, the team at Diplomacy Delivered reminds me that we absolutely want to get to audience questions. And so if you would use the chat feature below, do please send in your questions. And as they come in, we will try to, Erin, if you don't mind, we will try to weave them into the conversation. Because that is, it is an important feature of I could talk to you all day long, but it's important to get other voices, other questions in there as well. Turning slightly from the program that you went on to your thinking in general about Australia, the United States, and the Indo-Pacific, let me just note that you have been really instrumental in your work with young Australians about connecting young Australians to the Alliance, exploring how young Australians might even become more involved in the U.S.-Australian Alliance and why. If you don't mind, just a broad general topic or broad general question to begin with. Why do you feel it's important that Australians should care about the U.S.-Australia Alliance?
Yeah, great question, Gavin. And I don't know that you sent that one through to me on my brief, but it's a really good question and something I've thought a lot about over the last year in particular. And I think it all goes back to the history. And I think, and the foundation in which Australia has developed over the last 100 years. So, we sort of go back to that role that Australia and US have played together right back to, World War II. And for me, as the daughter of a veteran, the granddaughter of a veteran, the great-granddaughter of a veteran, those values were always very dear to me and close to me. And I always worried that as generations go by, we start to lose some of that understanding of our shared history and those shared values that Australia was really built on. So that for me was why the alliance was so important. But I think what's interesting, without bringing up the C word, which is COVID, is that we're starting to now see those values come back out again and come through again, and that young people, and when I say young, I mean my age, younger, even slightly older, who hadn't been exposed to war in the same way or conflict in the same way that some of our predecessors had. We're now starting to see those values come back through again, and that foundation. We can leave it there in terms of what the roadmap into the future looks like, but I think that's what we're starting to see now again, and that's very much why I've always thought that the alliance is important, and for young people to be engaged in it as well and to understand that history.
Absolutely. Do you think that how the United States views the Indo-Pacific is shared by Australians? Or let me put it the other way. Do you think how Australians view this part of the Pacific, but your relationship, what's important to you in the Pacific, is viewed by the United States similarly? Or what would you, if there are differences, what do you think the differences are?
Yeah, I think this kind of actually does circle back to the IVLP experience in some ways, and so one of the things I learned out there as well when I was in DC was I did feel that there was a bit of a lack of understanding about how Australians think differently about the region, whether and not coming at it particularly from a defense angle or a strategic angle or anything like that, but just quite simply our role in the region. And that goes back to the nature of our trade relationships, the nature of our trading partners, the nature of our geography, the nature of, like, this is actually our neighborhood where we are. And so anything that can potentially disrupt those relationships, make relationships more difficult, whether it be Southeast Asian countries or the Pacific, that, it's built, we do come from very different fundamental positions, I think. And again, like I said, it's based on where we are, the nature of our trade relationships, and so on. So I do think that we view the region differently, but I think that we have shared interests in the region, and it's okay to call that out and say that we might look at things differently, but we have the same values and similar interests. So I think that's actually what's more important to look at.
That's helpful. What would you say are some of those shared interests?
So I think that a lot of us in this foreign policy space are sort of used, where we all sort of know what we mean when we talk about shared values. We think about democracy. We think about, well, what are those aspects of democracy that are important? Like having free elections and open elections, having a free press, having the ability to trade with people. And I think that, it's actually those core values versus a counterbalancing exercise that's actually more important. So read between the lines there. I think that there's this big conversation about, well, it's about counterbalancing China, and that's our shared interest. But I don't think it really is. I think it's actually, again, goes back to what our values are, and that's what we should be pursuing. Now that might create more balance in the region. That's probably a good thing. But that's, it's those aspects of our values that are really important here.
I couldn't agree with you more. From a U.S. perspective, we often approach it as we feel that we have no better friend and partner in Australia in the world in general. A lot of it is, again, the shared values, the shared history, and the shared interests. I think that being a U.S. official in Australia, that is where we start from in our thinking. It's that partnership in Australia being a very valued and respected partner of ours through thick and thin for more than a century. But honestly, thinking of the future, we like to say that there are things that we can only do with Australia because we come from a similar background, shared values, but also our economies are so linked up that the level of knowledge, the level of whether it's STEM or you're looking at business, there isn't a lot of backfill there. You're operating at a very high level. Our R&D folks, our industry folks fit naturally with Australians and vice versa. And together we're able to work in very innovative, future-oriented ways that I think, the jobs of the future, I'm not smart enough to see them now. But my kids will be benefiting in their lives, either directly or indirectly, from this relationship with Australia as Americans, precisely because you're where we are and we share so much in common that honestly the future will benefit as a result directly. There's a direct benefit for me and my kids. So that's kind of how we see it. If I could throw in our first question from the audience. This is from Elise Stevenson. What do you?
Hi, Elise.
Absolutely. What do you think the priority should be for the Australia-U.S. alliance post-COVID-19?
Well, I mean, I guess the thing that everyone's thinking about right now is economic recovery. And the United States is our largest economic partner when you factor in both trade and investment. So how we work together in terms of economic recovery for both countries is going to be really important. Thinking about some of our critical industries, where can we attract investment in those, whether it be med tech, ag tech, and others. So is the United States going to be a great investment partner for us? I think that'll be really important. But, the thing that it seems to me that everyone's going to be thinking about now is the economic recovery. I think that US and Australia are in very different situations and positions right now. And obviously you've got in the US your own complexities and you've got unknowns with, your presidential election this year as well. So How that plays out, I don't know, but that needs to be a focus, is going to be the economic recovery for both countries. And for Australia, investment from the US is going to be really important, I think, in those critical sectors, which kind of leads on to what you were saying, Gavin, earlier about, jobs of the future. Well, what industries are they going to be in? And how does Australia and the US match up on those? And like I say, it's things like ag tech, med tech, fintech as well is really important. So that needs to be the focus in part of the roadmap forward.
Well said. Do you think that also with the reexamination due to COVID of things like supply chains, global supply chains, not just in med, though, of course, that's the first thing that jumps to mind given COVID, but is this an area, do you see this as being an area where we stand to benefit by working together to develop more robust, resilient, and interlinked supply chains between like-minded countries, rather than have this largely, China-based supply network that obviously, when you have a pandemic like we've had, drastically impacts every aspect of life?
I think that if the pandemic has shown us anything on a really large scale, it is Australia needs to diversify its interests across a whole range of different areas, and supply chains obviously being one of them. I think what we're seeing is a big move towards protectionism around the world now, and that's by countries wanting to have their own more independent and resilient economies within their nation state. You're seeing, we've seen it across Latin America. Argentina just pulled out of Mercosur free trade negotiations, saying they need to protect their own economy. I don't know how that's going to work, but whereas for Australia, like having free trade and that's what our economy has been built upon. We know that works for us. So then what does that mean for supply chains as well? And I think that again, this is about diversification now. So how do we move away from being overly dependent on anyone? And that's not to single out China either. It would be if we were overly dependent on anyone right now, that would be really problematic. So this is about diversify. And we've been saying that, I've been saying that, analysts have been saying that, and I've written on this with our former foreign trade, defence and everything else minister Stephen Smith when I was at Perth US Asia Centre on India as one of those possibilities. Others have written on Indonesia. Others have written on other Southeast Asian countries, focusing on ASEAN broadly, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. How do we identify now what those opportunities for supply chains, but also more broadly economic diversification? What does that look like?
Absolutely. And if anything, maybe COVID has reinforced that those fundamental principles of diversification and trade are now more important than ever.
Yeah.
It's kind of back to basics, if you will, rather than over-reliance on one source. We have a question from Haley, and if I mispronounce your name, I'm sorry, Winkham. Do you think the US-Australia alliance complements Australia's other relationships in the Indo-Pacific, such as our partnership with ASEAN?
Hi, Haley. Nice to see you. So, yes, of course it does. But that's okay. I think there might be a bit of a knowledge gap here, though. When one of the programs that I had the privilege of working on with the embassy earlier this year was sort of focused on the state of the research in the US-Australia alliance. And one of the big questions that came up was, well, how does Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian countries perceive Australia's relationship with the US in the region? And, unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we just blame everything on COVID-19 now. We don't have the funding to do that research. But I think that's a really interesting question. Like, yes, we know that at some level it does complicate things, but actually how do these countries and how do their elite view Australia's alliance with the US in the region, and what are the implications for Australia? I think there's a real knowledge gap there that could be filled, and perhaps, maybe the embassy wants to fund something like that one day. But yeah, I think it's a really good question. How does it complicate those relationships? And I mean, you can see that if you look at ASEAN as a bloc, you can see that it's the US-China relationship could have implications in certain countries for Australia in our cooperation with them. Cambodia is an example of that. I don't know that it necessarily has had implications, but it could because of the nature of their relationship with China, and others. So I think we can point to those examples, but there is some work to be done in actually examining that more broadly.
Well, you'll have to send your proposal in, and maybe Haley as well has a proposal that can come into us, which we would warmly receive. Again, I welcome everything you just said. To add just a little U.S. kind of how does the U.S. view it into the conversation? I think we definitely focus on Haley's word complement. We definitely view our relationship, our alliance with Australia is really a launching pad for our interactions with other countries in the region. Not that we don't have a tradition of bilateral relationships across Asia, we do, and it's meaningful. But honestly, we look to export, if you will, a lot of what makes this alliance special and this relationship special. Again, it's founded on shared values, shared principles that we hope are universal and can apply to other nations. And so our relationship with Australia will always be foundational, if you will. But we hope that it is big enough and secure enough and strong enough, which I'm sure I have complete faith that it is, to bring others in as well, that serve as a platform to expand throughout the Indo-Pacific.
I think that's a really good point, Gavin. One thing that we often talk about, can Australia be the bridge? The bridge to Asia, the bridge to ASEAN, the bridge to India, whatever it is. And I think that Australia is really we sort of oversell it, but we underperform on it. When I was in Chile 2 years ago now, in conversations I was having with government, they were saying, one, can we join ANZFTA? No. But two, we want our own ANZFTA. Like, how do we, get a trade deal with Southeast Asia? And I was like, okay, well, all I can do is this. And they go, no. How do you pick up the phone and ring them? Like, how do you even initiate that conversation? And that's a great role that Australia can play, whether we do it for the US or other countries or other regions who, again, have those shared values and shared interests for why they're doing it. So I think that that's something we really undersell ourselves on, our capacity to do. We think that we're terrible at engaging with Asia, but actually that's okay. We've been kind of doing it the longest, in terms of our engagement with ASEAN as a dialogue partner, with China, with Korea, with Japan. So we've been doing it a long time compared to other regions. So how can we help to facilitate that more? I think that's a really good point, Gavin.
And just to pick up on this before we go to our next question, again, as an American and lucky enough to be in Australia and working with Australians on a daily basis, you do have a very respected and valued voice internationally in the region, but honestly in the world. And so we feel quite good as the United States anytime Australia speaks up. And we're, as is often noted, we're good enough mates that yes, you can criticize us and we can still, go for a pint afterwards. But that's a mature, confident relationship at work, and we as the United States benefit from that. I think that we welcome. I know that we welcome every time Australia speaks up internationally. The ambassador has been quoted as saying that there are times that he wishes that Australians had as much confidence in themselves as we, as the United States, have in Australians. Sometimes that can be a little controversial, but honestly, it comes from a good place, and that just is we see how well respected Australia is, how much of a leader you already are, the Australians already are on the world stage in the region, and it's a good thing. So,
Yeah.
we definitely support more of that. Our next question is from Alexander State. Without Australia to serve as a quote Western cultural buffer between Europe, the U.S., and Southeast Asia, would relations with that region be more difficult?
Do you mean the relations of those other regions like Europe and the US, or just in general?
I think it's relations between Southeast Asia and Europe and the U.S. would again, this I think gets back to what role does Australia play as the bridge?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so, it's that notion of, okay, so how can I describe this? When so I do a lot of work with the G20, and generally our delegates are based in Australia. They're not based in the country that the who has the G20 presidency that year. And a couple of years ago, when we were choosing a delegate for the W20 for Japan, instead of choosing someone who is based in Australia, we decided to choose an Australian woman who lives in Japan and lived there for 27 years, spoke the language. And that was really strategic because we wanted to have someone who had boots on the ground. So boots on the ground and in the know, someone who could understand the language, someone who could understand the cultural nuance of conversations, of difficult conversations, who could embed herself in the politics of the G20 and whatever was going on. And if you could think about it, it's like Australia in the region, but for the world. And it goes back to that point I was just making, like, and being able to be a bridge. I think, of course, things might be more complicated in the same way. If we turned up to a G20 meeting and had never been to Japan and had never had anyone on the ground, we all of a sudden have to kind of, you clash because you've got all of this extra water that you need to get over before you meet them on the other side. I hope that's a useful analogy, but of course, I think that, things would be more complicated, but Australia needs to see its value with that as that player in the region too.
Absolutely, and not just as a bridge, but I think sometimes easy to forget how Australian thinking on the region has shaped how we view the region in the United States. I would be remiss not to point out that Australians were calling the region the Indo-Pacific long before we were. And we agree with you. We changed our view of this region from more of an Asia Pacific view to an Indo-Pacific view, largely because of our conversations with our Australian friends and allies. Speaking of that part of the Indo-Pacific, Erin.
Good segue.
And especially because you've spent a few years in Perth, in Western Australia, which is, honestly, you can't get more Indo-Pacific than that, and be in Australia, right? So to what extent do you think that it is still kind of an aspiration? And to what extent do you think that it is taking shape as a reality?
So to pick up the Western Australia point, the Indo-Pacific is a geographic reality for Australia. And if you want to go back to, again, those different views on how we see the region, like for us, at a very simple level, it's a reality. When you sit on Cottesloe Beach in Perth, you overlook the Indian Ocean. Next stop is India. So that's, and I think that in terms of our foreign policy, that's been shaped, and defence policy, that's been shaped by the fact that we've had successive defence and foreign ministers from the west coast of Australia across many, both Liberal and Labor administrations in Australia. Without a doubt, that has shaped our foreign policy and defence policy. So that's my little point there. What was the exact question about India?
Just to what extent is the part of the Indo-Pacific still an aspiration? So you've talked about it being a geographic reality, but in terms of geopolitics, to use a lofty overused term, but in terms of the workings of the region, how much of a role do the Indians play at this point, as opposed to how much would we like them to play going forward?
Yeah, so I think that goes back to a question about, well, what is what is the Indo-Pacific? Like, what does it mean? It's not, if you think about Asia-Pacific, like there's no membership to the Asia-Pacific. It's just a concept that everyone accepts. And then you do have regional architectures that sit within that framework, but take those away, the Asia-Pacific is still the Asia-Pacific because it's the geographic reality of where we are. So I think that, it depends again on what those objectives are. Quadrilateral is a really good starting point in saying that there's some reality to an Indo-Pacific that includes India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. If you want to look at it from a trade perspective, you would probably argue that India and the Indo-Pacific is probably oversold, in the sense that India chose not to, at this point in time, join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which would have been probably the first real Indo-Pacific trade architecture. So in that sense, no. And then the other thing I'd point to, I know that India has said that they're interested in pursuing bilateral trade negotiations with Australia again, but we've done that before and we haven't got there either. So I think there's still a lot of questions here about what role does India want to play in the world. And also, again, so let me digress a bit. One of the things that really frustrates me, having spent 8 years traveling in and out of India for work, is that we always talk about, like, we only kind of achieve or arrive at the Indo-Pacific aspiration once we get a trade agreement or a regional trade agreement. But people have been working between Australia and India on so many different projects over that time that just I've been involved in, and dating back further again. Is that soft diplomacy? Is that soft power that we have? Are those people-to-people linkages that we've got with India? Is that diaspora that we've got with India, which is, now having a big influence in Australia? Does that not count for some kind of definition of what the Indo-Pacific is? So in that, I mean, my natural mindset is to fall to India because I've spent a bit of time there, and studying many aspects of Indian society and life and politics. But I think if you sit back, how actually are we defining this Indo-Pacific? And on a lot of indicators, you would say that we already are there. We've got a really good foundation. So it's a complex question. And then the next big one is, of course, what role does India want to play in the world? So it seems to me at the moment that India doesn't, you kind of have the charismatic world leader, but I don't know that, India's got a lot more internal or domestic issues right now that they seem to be focused on rather than global issues, which is my observation.
It's a good observation, and I benefited directly from your answer. It adds nuance, again, from your personal experience that I've not considered in thinking about India. To what extent do you think that this notion of Indo-Pacific also rests on democracies being kind of the foundational cornerstones of it? Not to go on too long, because that's a very simple question, but it seems more and more democracy as we know it is being challenged internally. The U.S., if you were to do polls, even here in Australia, the Lowy Institute polls, younger people, newer generations don't hold the same assumptions as older generations, and have questioned democracy as a viable form of government more than I think my generation did, maybe your generation. I'm a little bit older than you, not too much older, but
not too much.
Again, as you look at kind of the corners, the countries already playing or that could play major roles in this Indo-Pacific construct: India, Australia, Japan, Indonesia, the Southeast Asian countries, even countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Korea. To what extent when we talk Indo-Pacific, are we either directly or indirectly relying on some notion of democracy?
Yes, I think we are relying on the notion of democracy, and I think that is problematic because, again, if I go back to shared values and shared interests, this is something I've thought about quite deeply on the India side of things. It's okay to have shared interests and maybe not have shared and face up to the fact that you might not have some shared values. Turning to some of the domestic challenges in India right now, they're not necessarily markers of a healthy democracy. You've seen the change to Kashmir's status. You've seen the Citizenship Amendment Act, and all of these things have a discriminatory in some way. And so, how can we? I'm going to give you an example, and I hope I don't get in trouble for going down this path. But we sort of criticize China and the Uyghurs, but we don't talk about Kashmir and the fact that they still don't have free, open access to the internet, and their status changed without, some kind of vote to do that. You have a Citizenship Act that discriminates against Muslims living in border states around India, countries, nation states. So can we just, again, it's like, can we be a little bit more honest in our approach to these things? We might actually not have some shared values right now, but we do have shared interests, and that's a really important distinction as well. Like, I don't know that these two necessarily always marry up, and democracies are flawed. Democracies are not perfect. We know that our democracy is flawed, their democracy is flawed, democracy with Chinese characteristics is flawed, like the US's democracy is flawed. But we know that for Australia, the success that we have had as a nation is a result of democracy, is a result of free trade, is a result of working with like-minded partners like the US. So I think that that's really important to go back to.
And a good point for us all to remember. I mean, part of that is that shared values is shared standards and holding ourselves and others accountable to the shared standards. Your point is well taken. Let's work at another question, if you don't mind. This is from Chris Smith. Hey, Erin, do you think that the U.S.-Australia strategic alliance is too focused on traditional security issues at the expense of non-traditional security issues, such as climate change, he says maybe cybersecurity, and pandemics?
I don't think there's one answer for that. I think it's a little bit more complex, particularly when dealing with non-traditional security threats, like what we're seeing now with the pandemic, and what we're seeing in cybersecurity, and what we've seen with climate change. So cyber, I think that that's an area that we can really work with the US on, especially under the Five Eyes Agreement. I think, and I actually, Gavin, you probably got more idea about this stuff than me, is around, what is the amount of investment in R&D in cyber and that kind of thing from the US. I don't know those numbers, but I think that actually there are some aspects of non-traditional security threats that we probably already have a really strong relationship on. I know there was supposed to be a delegation that was going out to a fintech delegation to the US led by a parliamentarian that didn't go ahead. So there's real opportunities there, and I think that's a good thing. Climate change is really complicated because it deals with different domestic policies which have a domestic political agenda. But we should be working together on these things to find solutions. Again, the pandemic, I think we were into such different positions as countries. But I think that overall, it's not. I don't think they are at the expense of it, and I think that there's complexities around each of those different areas that I don't know if this is the right platform to go in. Like, we can talk about multilateralism and climate change, Paris agreements, climate change. This is a really big area to wade into, but there are aspects of these non-traditional security, of non-traditional security that we should be working on, and I think we already are working on.
I would just add to that by suggesting that more and more the security and the economic are intertwined. I think in this day and age, you can't really have one without the other. I think both our nations' complicated relationship with China kind of illustrates this. You could even look at cyber, 5G. There are real concerns, as the Australian government has pointed out, as we support as the United States in an over-reliance on a less trustworthy partner in 5G, and having economies link up between nations that share like-minded values or view the world similarly from a security standpoint it just makes a whole lot of sense. And so developing, say, I've read a lot recently about the not so much finding an alternative to 5G, but what comes after 5G, and does it make sense for a Five Eyes or a Five Eyes plus like-minded countries approach to finding what that next thing is, again, as a way to develop economically, but also in a secure fashion with partners who share the same values and protections, if you will. Your point about a lot of these issues don't exist in a vacuum, or are so multilateral, you can't really get an honest appraisal of them from a bilateral format, just thinking of the US and Australia. Very valid point. Again, we in the U.S. can take some heat on some of these, but I would point out also that just like Australia, you've got a strong traditional of government at the state level and federalism. We share that in the U.S. We have a few more states than you do in Australia, but a lot of policy really is determined at the local and the state level. Something that shocks many Australians when I remind them of this is that over the last 10 years, in the US, our GDP has gone up at the same time as our carbon emissions have gone down, and they continue to decline even with disagreements over the Paris Accord. I think going forward, it will take a world solution. We as the US need to come back to the table in a meaningful way on climate. Again, that's my personal and professional opinion, but we're not as far off as some people might think, and we benefit from hearing from Australia and the Australian perspective on a lot of these issues. You're dealing with a lot of the same challenges in a similar fashion that we are, both in terms of our internal politics as well as our position in the world. But I'm talking too much, and you're not talking. If I could jump to another question, this is from Mohan Matthews. The question is, what can the U.S. do to show leadership in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic and counter China's threat of economic consequences against allies, calling for an independent inquiry into the disease? Even though he's asking what can the U.S. do to show leadership, Erin, I welcome your advice for the U.S. or your thinking on that.
Well, I think you've asked two really big questions there, and neither of them are easy to answer. This is diplomacy delivered, remember? So it's I think that it's challenge. It is challenging for the US right now, and perceptions of the US are really challenged. Just anecdotally from everything I hear, I mean, even the people who were very supportive of President Trump have seen a few of the comments recently, and that's been really hard. Like, you know, the whether they were on the record or off the record remarks about the bleach and so on. You know, just that style of leadership doesn't seem to be what's cutting through. But also remembering that the US is an incredibly diverse place, and there's, you know, it's very complicated. And I think that that's why I think these elections this year are going to be so interesting to see what the outcome is, and then how that actually changes perceptions of the US in the world. I think that what's really useful to remember, though, about the US alliance is, despite what goes on at the top politically and who that political leader is that the Australia-US alliance goes much deeper than that. It's about the bureaucracies, and not just at those high levels. This goes really, really deep into our into the administration, into our defense and into business. So regardless of what's going on there in terms of leadership and perceptions of that leadership, if you're thinking about the Australia-US relationship, it's really unhelpful, I find, to look at what happened at the state dinner. That's good and important, but it's all of that other stuff that is underneath it that's really, really, really important. And how we work together on this this pandemic, again, because the situations are just so different and rapidly unfolding. If anyone who can tell you what the road forward is going to look like next week, in a couple, I think that they don't know. So it's a really complicated one, but I think go back a bit, and if you're looking at the Australia-US relationship and where we will work together and might work together, I don't think it's going to be at that high top level. It's actually everything else that's underneath it.
Our ambassador would agree with you.
Good, good.
Maybe not on everything, but definitely on the notion that the alliance is more than any one administration or our elected leaders. We're fortunate that at its heart, this relationship is a person-to-person relationship, if you will. It's people. It's, again, Americans who come over here, who study, who live, who work, who get to know Australians who travel, like yourself, who travel to the U.S., who go on programs, who study, who live, who work in the U.S. It's that fundamental ties between our two people that extend far beyond politics and far beyond international relationships. That's important. On the pandemic, I would just again refer to our ambassador, Arthur B. Culverhouse Jr. He had an op-ed in the Australian a couple weeks back, noting first off our admiration and support for the way Australia has handled its response to COVID-19. The Prime Minister, honestly, the way that the state governments have come together, the federal government, the national government of Australia has come together to respond to the COVID crisis at this time. That we need to be partners going forward. It's important not just for us, but for the region. And then things that you can get almost too caught up in the U.S. domestic response, and we're not quite there yet. I would definitely say, and with close to now, unfortunately, tragically, 60,000 Americans who have died and 1 million who have COVID, we've got a large challenge ahead of us. But we haven't stopped playing, I would argue, our traditional role, which is being there for the world. And being there for the Pacific. The ambassador pointed out in his op-ed that he wrote that we have been leaders in global public health and health in the Pacific. 52 million Australian that we've donated to strengthen, just for this crisis, to strengthen health responses in Pacific Island nations and others. I don't want to get too much into a laundry list of things that we've done, but we just like Australia, have pointed out needs in the region and are working together to meet those needs in the region to help respond and recover quickly, get economies back on track, get people healthy again. So I would just say that. There was a very interesting op-ed this morning. I don't know if you saw it, by Chris Uhlmann in the Sydney Morning Herald. But honestly, it held a mirror up to the U.S., but it also pointed out things, and one of them being that America does have its share of faults, but one uniquely American characteristic, which I fundamentally believe in as American, is that we own our faults. We shine a light on them on a daily basis and try to get better. And so I just leave that. We're starting to get near the end of time. Let's try to work in a few more questions. This one's from Finn Robinson. The question is, how many Australians maintain let me rephrase. I misread it. How may Australia maintain its positive relations with Taiwan in the light of increased pressure from the PRC to limit Taiwan's ability to engage with the wider world and ANZUS Alliance members?
Really good question, and I'll admit I'm not someone who pays a huge amount of not that's the wrong way of saying it. It's not I don't pay a huge amount of attention. It's that I have very little expertise on Taiwan and how Australia should manage it from a diplomatic perspective. I guess, you know, it goes back to, again, and I'm only going to touch on this really briefly, is that, you know, we you know, I remember very vividly when Qantas had changed their, you know, and taken Taiwan off the map and what that meant. I think that a lot of this will actually come down to what's going on in the business community as well. So without commenting on what the government does, you know, there's a question there around how the economic factors will influence how Australia sees Taiwan and China. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to continue to watch. Maybe it might be less of an issue if there's some kind of, you know, the diversification project again. If you have an over-reliant partner in one particular country or one particular market sector or something like that, then you become much more susceptible to what their demands are. And so it's not only government that will need to make decisions about this, but it's also on or decisions on how they manage this, but also how business responds and the way forward for business. That's going to be really important going on Taiwan.
How much do you view stability being key to that relationship, particularly for business?
Stability in which context?
Stability in that Taiwan remain independent, democratic, rather than potential invasion down the road or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, of course it is, though. Of course it is, because you know, you don't want any instability anywhere, and we've seen this with Hong Kong. What are the consequences of instability? What are the consequences for the economy? Now we've got the overlay of COVID-19 again, but you know, for Hong Kong, the instability there was, you know, it basically destroyed the economy. So if you're talking about business taking a leadership role, then the state of the economy as a result of stability or instability is critically important.
And I think one of the things that, at least for me, our conversation has highlighted is the relationship between security and prosperity. Honestly, they're symbiotic. You can't really have one without the other for the most part. And again, to get back to a very Australian notion of the Indo-Pacific, we, being American, we like lots of adjectives, but I think that it's illustrative that we often talk not just about an Indo-Pacific, but a free and open Indo-Pacific based on shared rules, shared values. And again, it's not that either the United States or Australia want to contain China in any way, shape, or form. Honestly, we want China, the People's Republic of China, to get onside. We want them to kind of come back to internationally agreed rules and norms and working on the same set of principles that the rest of us share and hold dear, to have those fair, free, open qualities maintain themselves in the Indo-Pacific that we as the United States, and I think you as Australia, also view as essential to our shared security and prosperity.
Exactly. I mean, you want China's economy to grow. You want everyone's economy to grow. You know, growth is a good thing, and so it can't. You know, it's not at the like. There is an example that I think, you know, of China's overseas direct investment recipients. Australia is, I think, number 4 or in the top 4. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in the Latin America work that I've been doing, which is my new hobby, is you know, when I'm working with those interlocutors there, I say it's not that we don't want you to benefit from China. You're in the lowest ranking recipients of ODI. It's about what are the conditions under which you want to take that investment. Of course, you should benefit from Australia. from China and Chinese investment, in the same way Australia has benefited as well, as in the same way it's benefited from US investment. But what are the conditions under which that takes place? And that's what we're really talking about here. And Australia's had to deal with our own challenges, with foreign investment review, and so we're grappling with these issues too.
Absolutely. Hey, Erin, it has been wonderful speaking with you this afternoon. I note that we're at time, but if I could leave you with just kind of one parting question, which is, again, for our audience, if you could sum up, why should they care about the U.S.-Australia relationship? Why should they, as Australians, want to invest in Australia's relationship with the United States?
It's a really easy question to answer. I think you used the word beautifully before. It's about prosperity. It's about the way that we live our lives. It's about how we as people have lived for the last 100 years since World War II, which the US, it helped to set and define those rules, values, and norms. Now they might change and shift, particularly after COVID. I think that COVID will define the next 100 years. And that's why, again, for our prosperity, for our standard of living, for the way we live our lives, having a partner that shares those values and interests, and put aside the political stuff, that's going to shape these next 100 years as we come out of this COVID crisis.
Erin, very well said. Thank you for spending part of your afternoon with me and with all of us. I think
Pleasure.
We all come away a little bit smarter thanks to you. Good on you.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Big thanks to the audience. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for turning up.